On a Prayer. Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 21. A Prayer in Desperation. Dusty Rhymes darted through the narrow alleyways of St. Louis, his heart pounding in his chest as he felt the cold night air bite at his skin. The city's shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him, threatening to swallow him whole as he pressed forward. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind was sharp, honed by years of navigating dangerous situations. This was different, though. This time, the stakes felt impossibly high. Jackson's men were everywhere. Dusty had been running for what felt like hours, the sound of footsteps echoing behind him, getting closer with every passing second. He was outnumbered, and the weight of Jackson's empire bore down on him like a heavy cloak, threatening to suffocate him. He couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The alley opened into a wider street, but as Dusty turned the corner, his stomach dropped. Two men stepped out from the shadows ahead of him, their guns drawn, blocking his escape route. Dusty's eyes flicked around the street, searching for another way out, but there was none. His only option was to fight. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he reached for the gun at his hip, his mind racing. But before he could draw it, another figure appeared behind him, and Dusty felt the cold, unmistakable barrel of a gun pressed against the back of his head. Trapped. For the first time in a long time, Dusty felt the icy grip of fear tighten around his heart. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought to stay calm, his mind whirling through possible escape routes. But the reality of the situation was clear. He was surrounded, outgunned, and completely exposed. Jackson had sent more men, just as Dusty had feared. This was no longer just a chase. This was a death sentence. The man behind him leaned in, his breath hot against Dusty's neck. "You're out of moves, Rhymes," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Boss says you're done." Dusty's pulse raced, his muscles tensing as he prepared for the worst. He had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. He could feel the danger pressing in from all sides, the weight of his enemies bearing down on him like a suffocating cloud. There was no way out this time. Or so he thought. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the air, breaking the tension like a knife. "Dusty!" Dusty's heart skipped a beat as he turned his head slightly, just enough to see a figure running toward him from the end of the alley. Roxy. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath coming in short gasps as she closed the distance between them. Dusty's mind raced, a flood of emotions hitting him all at once. Relief, confusion, hope. How had she found him? And why was she here? "Let him go!" Roxy shouted, her voice trembling but filled with determination as she approached the men. Dusty could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. Something that hadn't been there before. A strength, a resolve that burned bright despite the danger they were in. The man behind Dusty laughed, the sound low and mocking. "Looks like your girlfriend wants to join the party," he sneered, tightening his grip on the gun. Dusty's jaw clenched as he tried to think of a way to turn the situation around, but before he could act, Roxy did something that took him by complete surprise. She fell to her knees, right there in the middle of the street, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she bowed her head. "God, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "Protect Dusty. Keep him safe. Give him the strength he needs to get through this." Dusty's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the shift in the air, the tension that had been suffocating him just moments before suddenly dissipating, replaced by something else, something powerful, something he couldn't quite explain. The men surrounding him seemed momentarily stunned, their eyes flicking between Dusty and Roxy with confusion. But Dusty could feel it, deep in his bones. Something was happening. A warmth spread through his body, starting in his chest and radiating outward, filling him with a strength that wasn't his own. His mind cleared, the fear that had gripped him just moments before melting away as his muscles relaxed, his senses sharpening. And then, it happened. Dusty felt his feet leave the ground. He hovered in the air, his body suspended above the pavement as a bright, ethereal light surrounded him. His eyes widened in shock, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening, but the power coursing through him was undeniable. It was as if the very air around him had come alive, lifting him up, protecting him from the men who had been ready to end his life. The men backed away, their faces twisted in fear and disbelief as they watched Dusty hover before them. The gun in the man's hand shook violently as he stared at Dusty, his mouth hanging open in shock. "What the hell?" one of the men whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling energy that now filled the air. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He could feel the power surging through him, but it wasn't just his own strength. It was something else, something greater. And as his eyes met Roxy's, he realized the truth. It was her prayers. Dusty slowly descended back to the ground, his feet touching the pavement with a soft thud. The light around him faded, but the power still thrummed beneath his skin, filling him with a quiet, unshakable resolve. The men stumbled back, their eyes wide with fear as they realized they were no match for whatever force was protecting Dusty. Without another word, they turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had come. Dusty stood there, his chest heaving, his body still buzzing with the remnants of the power that had just coursed through him. He turned to Roxy, his eyes filled with awe and disbelief. "How?" Dusty began, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you—" Roxy stood up slowly, her eyes glistening with tears as she approached him. "I prayed," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I prayed for you, Dusty, and God answered." Dusty's breath caught in his throat, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been running from this truth for so long, refusing to believe that prayer could be the reason for the strength he had been feeling, the power that had saved him time and time again. But now, standing in the middle of the street with Roxy beside him, he couldn't deny it any longer. It wasn't just him. It was something bigger, something beyond his understanding. Dusty swallowed hard, his hands flexing at his sides as he looked down at Roxy. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You really saved me." Roxy smiled, though her eyes were still filled with the weight of what had just happened. "I think you're starting to realize, Dusty," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're not in this fight alone. There's something else, something greater, watching over you." Dusty's chest tightened as the truth finally settled over him, heavy and undeniable. He had spent so long fighting, so long relying on his own strength, his own abilities. But now he understood. It wasn't just him. It was prayer. It was faith. And it was the people who believed in him, who prayed for him, who refused to let him walk this path alone. Dusty took a deep breath, his heart swelling with a quiet, unshakable resolve. He wasn't done fighting. Jackson was still out there, and Dusty knew the battle ahead would be even more dangerous. But now, for the first time, he wasn't afraid, because he wasn't fighting alone.